I used to work for this company that sold and repaired mail meters. It was a strange job, and I met many strange people doing it. But this was by far the most bizarre. There is a facility called the State Hospital here. It's a public institution set on about 30 acres in the middle of town, surrounded by a high fence next to a military base. The place can best be described as a large campus of derelict red brick buildings that house people with mental disorders, from moderate to debilitating. None of the buildings are new, and many of them are very old, dating from the turn of the last century, set as they are against the backdrop of wizened pecan trees and rusting Khoisan huts. A small, silent town in the middle of a city. The journey to the reception building is a trip back in time. It resembled an orphanage from the fevered dreams of childhood. I was admitted to the main office, which was modern in comparison to the residence quarters that I had been observing with mild dread during my drive from the entrance. Their dim fluorescent bulbs glared angrily on the institutional green walls, which, as I waited for help at the desk, made me wonder how their surface could appear so glossy and so grimy at the same time. There was a hopelessness in the air. This was a prison. Time moved slowly, if at all, for these people. Finally, an exhausted-looking woman appeared from the gloom at the back of the office and told me someone would be around directly to show me to the machine. I stared out of the window at the desk of grey clouds overhead, which looked like thunderheads through the dark old tinting on the windows. At last, a man appeared walking down the empty sidewalk, shuffling with frail effort towards the building. He wore a dark khaki outfit and resembled a school janitor, but for the fact that he was no older than 20 and oddly childlike. His beady eyes peered out from a heavy and narrow brow. He had a strange bowl haircut, heavy black orthopedic shoes, and wore an odd expression. His lips twisted up like he was trying to suck air through his teeth. Was he a patient? An employee? I couldn't tell. This man was walking so slowly that I had an entire debate in my head about his identity. As he trudged towards the door, I picked patient. I was wrong. He produced a badge from his pocket and let himself in, telling me that he was going to take me to the machine. Finally, I thought. Time to get this done so that I can get the hell out of here. As I followed him on the 3-block walk to the building that housed the machine, I continued to marvel at the sheer strangeness of my surroundings. There were streets and blocks, sparsely populated with the barrack-like brick buildings. There were street signs and sidewalks, but it felt empty, orderly but unloved. The building that this muttering character was leading us to was particularly forlorn. The exterior was weather-beaten and tired. Chipping paint flaked from curling and broken trim. Rusty tear streaks from the roof ran in jagged branches down the white facade of this 2-story tenement, making it look like a savage old hag, weeping mascara down a craggy, tortured face that had seen too much. My guide produced a giant ring of ancient keys and unlocked the crooked door. As if by force of habit, he gave the door a hard shove with his foot, and it gave way. As I followed him inside, I saw that the paint on the door was worn clean away by years of people giving it the same kick to get in. The inside was a cramped hall with closed doors on either side, leading to a narrow staircase into darkness. He flipped on a bare light bulb at the top of the stairs and paused as he unlocked the door at the top, speaking for only the second time since we had met. Minutes ago, that seemed like hours already. "Now, I want you to know before we go in here," he said, his rat-like gaze suddenly trained on me with a disquieting intensity. "There are people in here." "Okay," I said. "It's a little strange," he replied. "Okay," I said. It turns out that my companion was a master of understatement. I strode past him into the room and was greeted with a vision that was so unsettling that I still think of it to this day. Arrayed around the perimeter of the room were small beds upon which writhed a collection of the most miserable wretches I had ever seen. They were all restrained to their beds by leather and canvas straps, with faces and bodies so warped by congenital abnormalities as to be barely identifiable as human beings. Blank eyes stared with hollow horror from black sunken eye sockets from every corner of the room. Strange guttural choking sounds erupted from behind a small curtain. What was so awful in there, I wondered, with naive terror, that the rest of these poor cursed souls must be protected from seeing it? I struggled to get my bearings, as the only light in the room came reluctantly through the planes of a single dormer window behind a dusty yellow curtain that looked as old as the building itself. It cast an anemic beam down onto the creaky floor, sinking the rest of the room into a pall of funerally shadow. This had the effect of making the people that lived in this room seem like prisoners in a horror story of the worst kind. People who would never see beauty or hear laughter for the rest of their miserable days. I turned to ask the man exactly what in the name of God was going on here, but the landing was empty. I walked a few steps over to the window and saw him walking in small circles in the yard out front, talking to himself. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed the mailing machine sitting perversely between two of the beds in the back of the room. A ridiculous mechanical centerpiece in the tableau vivant that only the devil could create. I tried to focus on the task and pulled out a small flashlight to illuminate the machine. I noticed a small, but steady increase in sounds of distress coming from the writhed and racked bodies that surrounded me. They knew I was a stranger. The bed to the right of the machine was occupied by a very thin and sallow woman, her arms crossed on her sunken chest and lank red hair partially obscuring her face. She rattled a cough, lips collapsing corpse-like around her toothless gums. To the left lay a lumpy form, a man, knees drawn up around atrophied torso, so crab-like and twisted that I was sure he had never left that bed. He stared at the ceiling, moaning with a high warble that was possibly amongst the saddest and most desolate sounds ever produced by any person. I plugged the machine in and was immediately made aware as to why they had called. It beeped and banged in a way that made it sound as if it were disintegrating internally. It was. A large gear had stripped, and the mechanism that the gear controlled was thrashing and grinding itself into dust. I immediately unplugged the machine, but not before the sound it made caused every one of the people inside the room to start moaning and screeching in a chorus of misery that caused me to start shivering as my very flesh tried to escape from my body. The red-headed woman suddenly started jerking around violently, her claw-like hands beating the stained bedsheets at her side. She began howling with a hollow, nasal bleat of a tortured animal, and I turned reluctantly to look at her. Suddenly, she sat bolt upright in the bed and reached for me. If it weren't for the strap holding her to the bed, she would have flown across the space between us. Hair parted from her eyes as she reached out, her cramped and bony hands, opening them towards me. I couldn't see the white of her eyes if she had any. Her expression went from a mask of horror to one of strange sympathy, which was somehow even more terrifying. She made a sound like her soul was fighting its way up the dark well of her throat into the black hole of her mouth. I was frozen, staring at her until her mouth fell all the way open and her moan grew even louder. Everyone in the room started to make a similar hellish sound. I had to get out of there. I was floating in a panic towards the door when my khaki friend appeared at the top of the stairs. I brushed past him and stumbled down the stairs towards the exit. I burst outside like a sailor escaping a sinking ship, and like that sailor, the moans of the ones I left behind followed me into the light. The man appeared at the door and yelled something to me as he locked it behind him. "What?" I said, looking back over my shoulder. "You dropped your flashlight," he responded. "Keep it," I said, swiftly jogging my way towards the parking lot. "Wait!" he yelled again, running swiftly into the empty street behind me. I reluctantly stopped. I could see my truck. I was almost free. "What's wrong with the machine?" he asked. "It's finished." I quit the next day. Have you ever heard of Kachina dolls? To understand these stories better, you have to know a few things about Navajo culture. They believe that you are not to own Kachina dolls because it is said that they come to life at night. Traditionally, these dolls were made by Pueblo medicine men. When they were made, their creators would bless them and put their hair into the center of the dolls. This was before they were mass-produced by other people and other tribes. The first story takes place in the late 90s. I wasn't there for this story, but it happened to my cousin. She moved into town and found a trailer to rent for a decent price. It was already furnished by her landlord that had just moved. She had asked my cousin not to move too many things, as she would be moving her stuff out over a period of time. Inside the trailer was a fake fireplace with a mantle on top. On the mantle were a collection of Kachina dolls. My cousin was a little wary of these as they are taboo to own, but she left them in place as requested by her landlord. The first night is when things started to get weird. So my cousin gets ready for bed and lies down. In the middle of the night, she is awoken by something dropping in the living room. She gets out of bed and heads to the living room, turns on the lights as she gets there, and looks around to see what had fallen, to discover 3 of the Kachina dolls laying on the floor. She thinks nothing of it and places them back on the mantle and heads back to bed. She was only lying down for about 30 minutes before she hears the same noise. She heads to the living room to see the dolls on the floor again. A little weirded out, she places them back on the mantel and heads back to her own room. But before she gets there, she hears the noise again. Only this time the thud is followed by what sounds like tiny footsteps. She goes to the living room to find the dolls further than they were when they had dropped in the first place. Definitely weirded out, she now tries to shake it off and places them on the mantel once more and goes to bed. She was in bed for another 30 minutes when she hears them fall, and then there are a little set of taps, like feet running across the floor. She finds the little dolls on the floor by the door. She concludes that there is no way the dolls could have fallen that far on their own. She was officially freaked out at that point and decides to collect the dolls and put them in a box and places the box in her closet. All night, she could hear the sounds of little scratches coming from the box. The next morning, she asks the landlord to take the dolls and hasn't had a problem since. The second story takes place in the 70s, when my grandmother was a teenager. She decides to spend the night with her cousin on the res. They spend most of the evening swapping stories, trying to spook one another out, when her cousin gets the great idea to bring out the Ouija board. They start by asking the typical questions. Is anyone here? When did you die? And the like. They played for a few minutes without any action and put it away for a while. They pull it out around midnight to resume the game and finally get a response. I don't know the specifics of what they initially asked, but it led to them asking, "Are you here?" The planchette moves to yes and slowly drags towards the picture in the bottom right, the face of a man behind the woman using the board. They are all convinced that the other is moving it to scare the other, and of course they swear they're not. So they decide to ask, "Where are you?" And the planchette spells out chimney. They grab their flashlight and head towards the fireplace and shine the light. About 5 or 6 feet up the chimney, they find a Kachina doll hanging there. There was no explanation for it being there, and no one could have placed it there, as they had built a fire there earlier in the evening. The ashes were still warm. They decided best to stop playing, and my grandma hasn't touched a Ouija board since. A few years ago, my mum was sleeping downstairs, and she had an encounter with something inhuman. I always used to get scared at night and knock on their door to sleep with them. And one night my mum heard a knock on her door and she assumed it was me. So she said, "Come in," while still half asleep. She heard the door open and heard something quickly patter across the ground and jump on the bed, and it began whispering in her ear, mimicking her voice. She freaked out, opened her eyes to see a very skinny, small, webbed-looking creature running out the room. Me and my dad awoke to her screaming. We believed the house was haunted because we all had paranormal experiences in the house. The previous owners were drug addicts who performed satanic rituals and the like. When I showed her a picture of a skinwalker, she said that it looked similar, but we don't know if this was a skinwalker, demon, or malevolent spirit. We were working in the old Fort Belvoir Hospital before our floor was ready for us to transfer to the new hospital. The old hospital had been there since World War II, if I remember correctly. It was a 5-floor hospital, and only the first and second floors were being utilized for patient care. The floors above us were used for storage, where they had moved unwanted equipment or furniture. The other day, me and one of my sailors went to see if they had an extra chair on one of the storage floors. So we get up to the floor that was used for the birthing floor and nursery. We both walk past a room with an old wooden rocking chair, and as we passed it, we looked at each other, and I said, "Did you see that?" Then my buddy said, "Was someone sitting in the chair?" I agreed and said I thought I saw someone sitting on the rocking chair as well. We went back to check, and no one was sitting in it, and no one else was on this floor because it was shut down. So we just kind of brushed it off and agreed that we might have seen a ghost. A few weeks later, we went back up to get something else we needed. We went back up to the same floor, and we walked past the room with the rocking chair. I saw a note taped onto the chair. The note read something along the lines, "Please do not use or remove." I found that odd, and asked my boss, who had been at this hospital a lot longer than me, why no one could touch that plain old rocking chair. He told me this was the rocking chair in the nursery that mothers would use to rock and spend time with their stillborn babies. That blew my mind, and confirmed what me and my buddy had seen was probably a mother who was rocking her stillborn. When we witnessed it, we didn't know if it was a man or woman, since we weren't looking directly into the room. We were just sure we saw a person. So I'm pretty sure we saw a grieving mother rocking her baby. My sailor who witnessed this took his own life not long after. He stayed at the old hospital at the small clinic they kept open there, while the rest of us transferred to the new one. I'm not saying him taking his life had anything to do with this, but the person who witnessed it is no longer with us. I regularly go thrift shopping in my small town in Ontario, Canada. About 3 weeks ago, I went to the Salvation Army to pick up some vintage finds. I sometimes go into the housewares and art section to see if there's anything worth picking up to resell. And that is when I saw it. I had always been interested in creepy, unsettling, and dark things, and this painting immediately caught my attention. It was as if it were begging me to take it home. I was overwhelmed by the sense of urgency. I needed this painting now for whatever reason. The more I looked at it, the more I discovered new details. It's not a particularly nice painting. It has a very unrefined feel to it. But it was not the style that drew me in. It was the subject matter. It was so odd. I ended up adding the painting to my cart and continued to shop around. The painting ended up costing me only $2, which I considered a deal since it came in a very nice old frame. I had it in my room for a few days before I noticed strange things happening. I live alone in an apartment, and it's generally quiet and peaceful. This all changed by the 3rd day that I owned the painting. At first, harmless things were happening, and I thought nothing of them. Instances included cupboards opening, things falling, lights flickering. I just attributed the cupboards opening to me being forgetful, things falling as me not properly putting things back, or the light bulbs as needing replacing. By the 6th day, the nightmares started happening. In my nightmares, some dark figure approaches the side of my bed from my closet, while I'm stuck in some sort of sleep paralysis, not being able to do anything while it comes towards me. It gets closer until it's at the side of my bed. It looks at me while frozen, but doesn't even have eyes. I've had this recurring dream for 5 or 6 nights since I obtained the painting, all with the figure from the painting coming to visit me. After the first nightmare, I knew that these incidents had something to do with the painting. The energy coming off it was just dark, and it got darker and darker until I was so uncomfortable that I moved the painting out of my room. Here is where things get even weirder. I decided to investigate the painting further and take it out of its frame. As soon as I took it out of the frame, this smell enveloped my house. The painting never smelled prior. It was only when I removed the glass and wood frame that the stench of sulfur came over everything. It was putrid. I immediately noticed the back of the painting, and it is terrifying. After the 5th or 6th nightmare, I moved the painting to my basement storage locker at the bottom of the apartment complex. The dreams have stopped, but the cabinets opening and stuff like that still happen. Something else started too. I sometimes woke up in the middle of the night to hearing what sounds like scratches in my front door. When I go and investigate, there's nothing there. I've asked my neighbors, but they don't hear anything. In addition to the paranormal occurrence, my health has also taken a hit since I got the painting. I've been feeling unwell, run down, and depressed all the time. I tried telling people about it, but no one really believes me. The only one who has said anything that makes me feel like I'm not crazy is when my dad came over and took a look at the painting. The first words to come out of his mouth were, "Damn, that's dark." The painting itself has a very odd subject matter. This is what I see. Please let me know if you see anything different. There is a dark figure sitting in a wooden chair staring into a mirror with its hand on its head, almost as if it is in shock. In the mirror, it is not the person's reflection, rather another dark figure standing in it. It almost looks like its hands are cut off, its arms are long, and there looks to be blood on the mirror. The walls are cracked and show plaster. There are also scratch marks with the same red on the mirror as on the wall. I'm wondering if this meant the person in the chair is trying to escape. There is also a box, which kind of reminds me of a Dybbuk box, in the corner of the room. Possibly the most disturbing part is the upside-down family portrait. I have no idea what it all means. Hopefully someone can give me some advice on how to remove the spirit from disturbing my home and my dreams. The artist is unmarked. There's no date either. If anyone has seen any similar paintings or styles, I'd love to get in touch. I want my life to go back to normal. I'm sure some of you people will probably tell me to throw it out or burn it, and I would. But I have this irrational fear that whatever spirit resides in that painting will get angrier. Me and 3 of my friends decided to go explore an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of our town. Nothing strange happened at first, but after a good half hour, we could hear whispering and random doors closing. The building has been empty since the 40s, and all 4 of us entered what seemed to be an operating room, when all of a sudden the door we came through slammed shut behind us, and the operation table in the center of the room slid very fast along the floor, slamming into the wall. One of our friends, Matt, left right then and there. Me and the other 2 stayed because we wanted to see if more cool things would happen. So the 13-year-old geniuses that we are decided to go to the basement. This is where it got really weird. We wandered around for a good 20 minutes and nothing seemed to be happening, so we went back the way we came. Except the exit to the basement wasn't there anymore. At first we thought we took a wrong turn, but this basement wasn't very big. We spent a good 2 hours trying to get out of there, and this was before cell phones were a major thing, and none of us owned one. All the while the whispering voices started again, and we began seeing things out of the corner of our eyes everywhere, constantly asking the others, "Did you see that?" We finally find our way out, walk outside, and it's midday, like 1 p.m. when we went in there at about 11 p.m. the previous night. So we just shrugged it off, not knowing the time, and started walking towards the one guy's house. 5 minutes into walking, and a cop pulls up beside us and asks our names. When we confirm, he responds with, "There's a search party out looking for you," and he radios in some stuff, and we're thinking, we're in so much trouble. Now here comes the part that no one can explain. About 5 or 6 other cop cars, along with our parents and Matt and his parents, show up. Apparently, after he left and went home, we were told that we had been missing for an entire day. We went in on Friday night and came out, and it's Sunday. Matt had obviously gotten worried and told his parents about it when he finds out that none of us got home. They called the cops, and the search party begins. They searched that entire hospital and couldn't find us. We asked if they had checked the basement, and they had apparently done so several times. We saw no one and heard no one while we were down there. When I was 10, my mum ran a daycare of sorts out of our house. My sister became friends with this vindictive, seemingly void of anything good, girl that my mum babysat. This girl used to brag about her brothers being able to make her troll dolls walk off her dresser at night. We obviously thought that she was full of crap, because she usually was. Her brother and his friends used to go cut themselves in a graveyard that was overlooked by a cult compound at the edge of town. Anyway, one day my sister and this girl got into some kind of spat, and the girl stole one of her Barbie dolls. My sister was livid, because like most girls, she was obsessed with her Barbies. So the next time this girl comes over, she returns the doll. Only it had half of its hair cut off and replaced with horsehair. It was sewed in. That night, my sister runs into my room, screaming at me that her Barbies are alive. Now, we grew up in a pretty strict religious environment, where lying was met with a beating. Being that my sister was the least likely to lie out of us 3 siblings, I started to get freaked out. According to her, she woke up and for some reason couldn't take her eyes off this particular Barbie. She said it stood up, stretched out like a human would after a long sleep, and turned her head to look right at my terrified sister. My sister pulled her covers back over her head, and the Barbie ran down the stairs, and that's when she came bursting into my room all frantic. I was so sure she was telling the truth that I sat at the top of our stairs with my metal Tonka truck, ready to smash it if it came back up. We never saw the Barbie again. Every time I've asked my sister about it as an adult, she still sticks to the same story. This happened in a city in the north of Peninsula, Malaysia. My family was visiting my wife's cousin, who had just given birth. She was in a room with 6 beds. 5 of the beds were occupied, and each bed had a curtain that could be pulled around the bed. It was visiting hour, and so the curtains were mostly pulled back, and there were visitors at all of the beds. The cousin was in the middle bed, and the last bed was occupied, but the bed opposite that one was empty. There were people visiting at the last bed. One of them was a young girl of perhaps no more than 7. As people were chatting, the girl suddenly cried out in anger, "Leave my aunt alone." Everyone looked at her. Her mother went beside her and asked, "Who are you talking to?" "Them." She said that while pointing to a spot just above the empty bed. "What are they doing?" asked the mother. "They're making faces at Auntie." Her mother then said to her, "That's okay, they won't do anything. Come, let's get a drink." She then led the little girl out the room. I think she was trying to calm her down. I asked some of the nurses, and was told that that wing of the hospital is reputed to be haunted, and it was the oldest building in the hospital complex. I guess kids really can see ghosts. I later realized that the mother didn't seem surprised at all at what the girl had said, as if it was something perfectly normal for the girl to say. I was very young when this happened. I don't think I'd even started going to school yet. I don't remember much about that stage of my life, but I still think about this experience to this day. It was near Christmas, and there was a doll my younger sister and I looked forward to playing with every year. It was an angel, where you'd press the button and she would sing Silent Night. The thing is though, once I was done playing with it, I had to return it downstairs. My parents eventually realized we forgot to bring it downstairs, so I was sent upstairs to retrieve it alone. As I went to my room to get it, I heard the doll sing Silent Night. The doll had a history of going off on its own, so I thought nothing of it. I went up and opened the door. My room was completely dark at the time, but when the light from the hallway came in, it shined on the pitch-black figure of a little girl who was playing with the doll. The girl immediately turned her eyes on me, and I stared back at her in shock. My vision blurred, and my ears were ringing, and the next thing I knew, I had to pick myself up from the ground. Nobody seemed to notice I hadn't come downstairs, and confused and unable to comprehend what happened, I would just go downstairs with the doll, seeing as the girl has left. I returned the doll and carried on with my day, because I had no idea what the hell had just happened. My earliest memory as a kid is standing up in my crib and screaming my head off, while an entity growled aggressively and shook my crib from underneath. I can still vividly remember this, even though it's been decades. Over the course of my life, I've had countless experiences and encounters, each very different than the other. By my mid-20s, I believed I simply suffered from some sort of variation of sleep paralysis, and shoved it to the back of my mind, choosing to ignore it. However, back in 2014, I had a series of belief-changing revelations about the nature of my problems, shifting it from sleep paralysis to demonic oppression. I dream in twilight, precisely right before sunsets. It's that dark, murky light that allows you to move around the house, but makes everything grey and eerie. I've also never had a happy dream in my entire life, one where I felt excited, joy, or positive in any way. I've never felt self-pity or sorry for myself. I just thought that was the way it was when you dream, having never questioned this before. I only recently discovered how weird that is through a discussion with a close friend. Greater than 90% of all my dreams/incidents involve me laying exactly in the same position I'm sleeping in. During the incident, with twilight gleaming over everything, I can't tell that I'm actually not awake. The mood or atmosphere in the room is the blackest, loneliest, most isolating feeling with the most intense presence of evil that I honestly can't use words to convey accurately. You can only experience this sort of evil. The most vivid, detailed entities, creatures, twisted humans that have visited me. I've never seen anything like this in Hollywood movies, but I can tell that someone in Hollywood writing the scripts have been inspired, most likely because they've seen them too. What do they do to me, you wonder? They're attempting to get me to engage them in a conversation, and I sense they're trying to offer me something. However, I've never engaged them. Once I realized I was being visited, my fear spiraled up to the most insanely intense levels that I could begin to hear my physical screams bleed into this dream. Right when they make a move to escalate the engagement, I exit this dark realm with a physical scream, and everything that was there just blacks out of existence. Does that sound like a classic case of sleep paralysis? That's what I told myself, and subsequently suffered for decades. I've kept a log of dozens of individual incidents over the years, but the purpose of this is to tell you my overall story. I'm excellent at my work because I can take care of explosive situations, calm enraged customers, and turn it around into a successful business relationship. I could walk into a room and sense people's moods, if they hated me, if they liked me, or if they thought me untrustworthy, if they were assholes as well. This may sound like total BS, but I can't explain it, because there's no logical way to convey this to people who haven't experienced it. How do you explain the color red to a blind person who's never seen anything in their entire life? Red is red, and that's where every foundation description begins when describing that color, right? Explaining my gut sense was very much like that. Regarding animals, particularly dogs, I had an affinity that was bizarre. I like them. I'm practically the opposite of a huggy, cuddly, sensitive dude. I don't seek them out. I don't watch dog YouTube videos. I'm just cool with them, generally speaking. Anyway, I've been around hundreds of strange dogs over the past 10 years, having close and extended proximity to them, and within minutes they'll be in my lap, rolled over, wagging their tail and allowing me to pet them. The people who own the dogs will usually choir off one of these things. That's weird. I've never seen Fluffy do that before. Or, wow, usually Mabel wants to kill anyone. I knew something was weird when I walked up to two drug house dogs. Think junkyard dogs. These aren't pets, they're not coddled, and are only kept outdoors and never shown affection by the owner because they have a single job to do: clear out dangerous criminal elements in drug flophouse. These dogs are the shock troops that they send in after the initial verbal warning to clear out. These dogs are vicious, nasty, and basically hate all humans other than the handler that feeds them, and they always clear the house. They were in a fenced-in kennel and going nuts with other people in the room. They were growling nastily through the chain links, pacing, barking threateningly, and I looked at them and felt a tug in my gut. I was completely calm and unafraid, and started to walk up to the fence. The owner yelled that I better keep my distance. The dog's eyes locked with mine, and I stood inches away from the dogs through the chain links. They all sat down easily and patiently watched me from a calm, at ease position, completely silent and non-agitated. They seemed either comfortable or intrigued for whatever reason. The dog's owner just said, "I've never seen that happen before." He was dumbfounded. These dogs would still shred me to pieces, no doubt, but I felt that they knew I would never be arrogant enough to think that I could pet them. They could have opened the kennel, and I know they would have been fine to me. To bring this back to the discussion though, over time I started to piece together that there's something weird going on with me. I slowly started to go from a complete skeptic on the supernatural my entire life, towards believing that for every New Age belief, there is probably some truth of it. 2014, the year of my demonic oppression crescendo. A combination of a very stressful job and a significant upticks in incidents led to a low point in my life. I'm 6 foot tall and dropped to 140 pounds. For reference, I'm finally approaching 170. I'm still questioned by friends and acquaintances if I'm ill. And at the time, I looked like an extra for The Walking Dead, all without needing any makeup. I couldn't eat meat because it didn't sit well in my gut for days and would cause me immense agony. I would sleep an hour at a time, awaken, be up for an hour, and doze off repeatedly throughout the night. I've had nerve issues where my body would jerk involuntarily, and I would lose feeling in my thigh if I stood up too long. After work, or whenever I would travel out of town, often I would fall asleep right as I came home from pure exhaustion, sometimes not eating and sleep until the next morning when I'd get back to work. Through all of this, I would have frequent and multiple nightly incidences that would disturb me and my wife. I was slowly dying physically, though I stubbornly chose to ignore it. My wife would constantly get comments like, "Is he alright? What's going on?" Or more to the point, "He looks like he's gonna die." My wife would post pictures of me on Facebook occasionally, events or birthdays, and would immediately get responses that are horrified, asking if I had cancer. Oddly, my wife had several New Age friends that would comment, "He's surrounded by dark spirits," and "There's a dark cloud surrounding his life aura." How can you deduce that from a photo? I have no idea, but I eventually grew to believe them in time. Emotionally, I was completely blank. I felt nothing. No sadness, no anger, no joy. The dam finally broke when I had an incident where I woke up screaming. That part is normal, but my wife looked truly frightened this time. I asked, "What's different this time?" She said, "You were screaming, 'Stay away from my wife.'" She decided to take a non-traditional problem-solving route at this point. This is when things got really weird. My wife and I went on vacation to the East Coast. On the last night, we had a bad argument and she left upset, driving to a small southern city to take her mind off things. I stayed in the hotel and she was walking along the boardwalk when a man popped out to give her a free reading to a fortune teller. She went to see the fortune teller. Keep in mind this fortune teller knew nothing about the situation. I'll reference to the fortune teller as Gypsy, and here's a breakdown of the conversation they had. The Gypsy goes, "Who's emotional?" And my wife bursts into tears. "Me." "Why are you so emotional?" "I fight with my husband." "Why?" "My husband isn't sleeping. It's affecting his mood drastically. It's worse than ever." "He has anxiety? And he isn't sleeping?" "He sees something, but it isn't a dream." "What do you mean it isn't a dream?" "It wakes him up, this thing. He isn't really an insomniac. It's something he sees every night." His eyes are open, but they aren't at the same time. Do you know what it is? Yes, it's a very bad entity. Your husband is so incredibly alone and isolated. The fear he has to deal with nightly is unimaginable. He has no one he can explain these things to. Does the entity have a name? Yes, but this is something we do not talk about. He made a contract with him in a previous life, and it wants to collect. Your husband knows him. How do we get rid of it? I could help, but he has to be ready for it. He blames me, and it's all my fault. No, your husband was like this before. It wants him to think it's you. The moment I moved in with my husband, he turned into this. No, it's not your husband. This thing is trying to drive a wedge in your relationship and try to manipulate. It wants him to go off into solitude, wants to isolate him for whatever it plans. The moment you're married, your husband, it got furious. What does it want? It wants to collect. It tries to speak with him. Jabberjaw, fast flapping mouth, not really like a human movement. Your husband does exactly what he should to break out of it. Its lips are moving in the dream. Your husband does not engage. What is it saying? You do not want to know. The movement you speak to it, it gets power. It's not just vacation, it's everywhere. It's not you. It wants you to think it's you. Just ignore it. What do I do? Go back. Your husband is worried about you being alone at night. This comes from his mother's side. His mother was always very odd, wasn't she? You're nothing like your mother-in-law. He has another sibling who has this. His brother? No, it's a sister. She's really into one thing that makes other people uncomfortable. She does things that makes others think she's weird. Should my husband call her and try to help? No. She tells no one about it. She suffers and deals with it on her own. She will not engage your husband in this conversation. Your husband has got to have the answer before he can figure this out. How many people have you known to have this sort of problem? Maybe 3. 2 have beaten it. Doesn't help that his job is wearing him out. Your husband has never had joy. He's done normal things but never felt it. The one thing your husband has is absolute total disappointment. He's done everything right, played by the rules, and done everything that's expected, and he still has not obtained happiness. That was the conversation. Jump to a few months later. My wife had a psychic stop by one day to read a dog. It's just the kind of novelty thing she thought would be funny. We didn't know this person. It was a paid professional visit. When the psychic arrived, I decided to walk upstairs to be friendly, and she was staring at me with a very concerned look. "Hi," I said. "What the heck is going on in this house?" said the psychic. "What do you mean?" "As soon as I stepped through your door, a seriously bad entity said to me, 'I'm not interested in you.' We discussed a little longer, and my wife asked, 'What should we do?' She said, 'This isn't anything I can help you with. I'll have to talk to a shaman. I know one who's dealt with this before.' At the time, I thought this might be a racket. The psychic is just setting us up for another New Age service from one of her colleagues. However, this entire scenario was eventually corroborated independently from the gypsy fortune teller, who did not know this psychic or the shaman. I've never told the fortune teller their names. Yet, this is like a bad movie, only I was living it. Fast forward to the shaman. We talked several times and I initially turned down his offer of services. He was going to visit our house and was insistent that the psychic attend. The shaman said that he couldn't do it alone, and that he needed the psychic there to help him. The psychic was surprised when I told her that the shaman was adamant in visiting my house. She said that he never visits people at their house. This bit of information is relevant later, when I meet the East Coast fortune teller later on. I schedule a time for the shaman to visit, ultimately giving up on any resistance and deciding to roll the dice. I had nothing to lose at this point. The shaman shows up in the morning and I took the day off. He walked in, walked up to me, frowned and shook his head violently and said, "I can hardly stand being near you. It's almost insufferable. Let me sage you first." He then smoked me with sage, said some sort of Indian chant, and then looked a little more at ease. He stared at me in the eyes for an uncomfortably long time and simply uttered, "You're beyond exhausted, aren't you?" He nailed it in that simple sentence. They then cleared the entire house. The sage would flare up like a forest fire around certain parts of the house, denoting a portal. Where I sat in my office, the sage smoked up instantly, and more intensely than anywhere else. The shaman stated this was an extremely powerful and extremely evil entity that had been attached to me my entire life. I asked him what it was, or if he knew its name. The shaman said he did know its name, but refused to say it out loud. He did state that he only knew of one other person that this particular entity had haunted. He cut off this line of questioning and proceeded to clear the house. As they were wrapping up, the shaman again stood in front of me, staring uncomfortably long, then asked a very odd and simple question. "Do you love yourself?" That struck me as oddly, as I'd never really been asked that. I smiled, pondered, and then a revelation happened several hours after he left. I internally forgave myself for being a failure. Simply put, I felt a knot in my guts loosen that had been there my entire life but I had just ignored. An exhausted calmness rolled over me. This was the pivot point I'd been waiting for my entire life. Fast forward to June 2015. I had far fewer incidents at this time, and started to feel better between the shaman visit and this vacation. My wife wanted me to go see the fortune teller, since I had never met them. I didn't have any agenda, so I agreed, thinking it could be intriguing academically. While driving there, I told my wife, oddly, suddenly out of the blue, "She knows I'm coming." I can't say why I said this. I just knew it to be the truth. I arrive in the fortune teller's parlor. After a minute or so of typical stranger small talk, the fortune teller abruptly stated, "I know who you are, and I knew you were coming." No kidding, exactly what I'd said days earlier while driving there. The fortune teller actually recalled the details of my wife's visit back in late September 2014. It was creepy and amazing at the same time. The context of all her comments and observations were all in line with my wife's visit last year. Another eerie thing was that the fortune teller looked like she could be related to my mother, almost as if they were sisters. I did have some small area of doubt at first, but my gut sense was telling me this fortune teller was the real deal. "The shaman was afraid of you and what was targeting you. When he first walked into your house, he wanted to turn around and run away. He didn't bring his helper, the psychic, to protect him. He brought his helper in order for the entity to attach to his helper, thinking she would be weaker and it would go for her rather than him. He thinks she is weaker than himself. He did it to protect himself. When I spoke to the shaman several times while brokering a visit, he always insisted that he needed to bring a second person. I thought he was trying to dupe me for more service fees. Maybe that's how this group of psychics feed into each other's business. In hindsight, the fee was ridiculously low. $100 for the shaman to come on site and $50 for his helper for 3 hours. It wasn't about the money, but they did need compensation for their time and travel. This wasn't a moneymaker for them. In hindsight, I think they genuinely did want to help me. I have no gut feeling regarding the fortune teller's reading on the shaman's motivation to bring the other psychic along for the home visit. It's possible, maybe even probable given his avoidance behavior later on in the story. The shaman is afraid of you. Also, about a week before we went on vacation and visited the fortune teller, I saw the shaman at a public event. He noticed me and looked away, and looked visibly uncomfortable. I got a really weird feeling in my gut, like he wanted to avoid me altogether. I said, "Thank you, things are better than they were," and he rapidly waved, nodded his head, turned away abruptly, and began talking to someone else. He did not want to engage me in any manner. The gypsy said that people used to be afraid of me, not in a physical sense or that I could harm them, but they would avoid me. And this is possible. It's hard to self-evaluate this. I've had random panhandlers tell me, "I don't want anything from you. You look mean." Not great for the self-confidence, but I've always brushed it off. Another thing the gypsy said is that I've sought help several times in the past, but none have helped me. That they were afraid of me, but not of me, rather what surrounds me. And although that's true, I did visit a shaman before, no one clued into my self-loathing. The gypsy went on to say that my mother experienced this entity haunting her the entire time she was pregnant, that she was extremely scared and worried, and she thought that she was going to lose me or miscarry, and that I was a high-risk pregnancy in multiple ways. It's important to note that this is true. Both my mum and dad had told me they were afraid they were going to lose me over the course of years. I've never thought once to ask what they actually meant by that. The gypsy said that my mum would sometimes not go to sleep for nights on end while she was pregnant, in order to avoid the entity visiting her at night. She had constant nightmares during her entire pregnancy, and that there was also a large sum of money for that time period. She, of course, was speaking of my mother's youth that was stolen. Someone either directly or indirectly lost their life as a result of this, and that my mum's side of the family has had money come and go, but none of them had found happiness and all still struggle to this day. This is true. My grandfather and uncle stole land rights from my mum and her sisters that were deeded to them. They forged documents, sold the rights and took the money. The lawsuit went on for decades and wrapped up shortly after my mum's death over 10 years ago. It was a big deal on her side of the family and created a schism they never recovered from. I said that my wife thinks that we should reconnect with my mum's family to figure out what might have happened, but the gypsies said no, and to stay away from them, and that my mother kept me from them for good reason, that nothing good could come out of reconnecting. She went on to say that my mum expected to lose me early in life. Her biggest fear was the entity getting to me, and that several weeks before her death, she called me to plead that I turn towards the light in her own way. She knew that something was going to happen to her very soon, and she was driven to make sure that I was safe even after she was gone. Everything she said, she nailed it. The last time I spoke with my mum was when I was living in a different state. I recall it being just a few weeks before she was killed. Mum called one night after work and went on for hours about getting back to church, praying and making sure I take care of my spiritual side, getting right with God. I spoke very little and sadly blocked out much of what she was saying. I said all the right things to my mum, but I was just on autopilot, just trying to appease her and get her off the phone. I was exhausted from work, and I blew mum off mentally while on the phone. This was the only time I can recall my mother being preachy. That was the only thing I recall her talking about. I still have some lingering guilt about my mindset on that phone call with my mum. The gypsy went on to say that while I sleep, the entity tries to show me something, and I sense that the entity puts a hand over my wife's mouth in order to stop her from waking me. The gypsy went on to say that since the shaman visited, and I've forgiven myself, or at least started to love myself, the entity is no longer in the room while I sleep at night. Then she said, "Why do I have visions of 2 floors of a house with people sleeping on both?" And I reply, my screaming in the night was becoming so bad that it was having an effect on my wife's health. I'm sleeping downstairs at night in order to get control of it. I don't feel the same entity plaguing me, but I still get frequent visitations by other beings that cause me to yell out. It's different, but I'm still yelling out into the night too frequently for my wife to rest easy. I see a tiny room, which opens up to a bigger and then larger room that you can look out of, over and through it. This tiny room with a tiny door is where the shaman trapped the entity. It's still in the house. She described the sump pump room exactly. The shaman was extremely bothered by this room. The sage he was burning bloomed like a forest fire around that room. The shaman didn't finish his job and didn't tell you the truth. All the crystals he gave you need to be buried down a road you can never drive past regularly, or thrown into a river somewhere. The crystals have absorbed the negative power and are keeping it there. Somehow, she knew there were power crystals placed throughout our house. Once again, uncanny and creepy. I see a teenager who is very angry. Yes, that's our neighbor's grandson. Is he dangerous? No, he's not dangerous. He's very angry because of his grandparents' anger. Your presence is causing every neighbor around you to be affected. They're afraid of you, and you're stirring it up for them, making it worse. You will do a lot of good for people in the future, just not right now. You're still working through a lot of things. People will seek you out for your help. You know we're both Christian. The Bible doesn't cover what you do in cases like this. That's why I'm not conflicted by coming to you. These two work in parallel and don't necessarily cancel out or contradict each other. No one in church or no pastor would deal with things of this manner. They would view me as possessed and just pray over me. It would help, but it's not enough, the gypsy said. For a period of time, the entity had you believing that you were seeing things that couldn't possibly exist. Footnote, she nailed it. How can she know this? I've always believed that I've had 2 types of events. One is simple dreams, the other is when I would lose the ability to tell if I was awake or asleep. These are extremely vivid, and the entities that visit me have details that I could draw and paint, as if I were using a magnifying glass on the dream. I'm able to zoom in on these things in the encounter, rather than the details unraveling. They just get more vivid. I've always believed I was seeing something with my waking eye and not dreaming. Since the fortune teller made this comment, I've shifted my belief that these aren't physical manifestations anymore. At least, not physical in our dimension. I have no doubt they're real in a different manner. However, the gypsy went on. Others in your family have this going on. For one, it has gotten worse recently. Everyone in your family isolates themselves. They call each other, but that's just going through the motions. This has affected your entire family, but no one talks about it between them. This is why no one calls each other. She wants to isolate and keep each person to their self. She also nailed the family dynamic. We never talk about our feelings with each other. I believe one sister has it the worst. She has been out there, mega religious, for decades now. She is also the sister that I am the most distant with. Ironic? I'll help you with this. You can do this over the phone, and I tell you what you need to complete in your house. I don't want money from you. She gave me 45 minutes of her time and refused to accept money from me. I don't know what this means or why she would be motivated to refuse money or why she would help me for free. But she went on to say, the whole time the shaman was there and had you go through his rituals, you didn't feel it. You felt like it was doing nothing. Yeah, I know it wasn't doing anything. The only thing that resonated was his question. Do you love yourself? I answered yes, but realized I didn't really mean it at the time. I started to think about it, and over the course of a few days, I felt in my gut that I forgave myself. This was when things started to improve. The entity hasn't visited me since November in my dreams. The shaman played his role, but didn't finish the work. Don't have him come back even though he suggested another cleansing of the house. The crystals you have scattered around, you need to rid yourself of them. Bury them along a roadside you never travel down, or throw them into a creek or river you never cross in your travels. She also somehow knew about these crystals the friends had given us. They're under the bed and in front of the mirror and scattered throughout the house. You have a very strong power in you that can be used for good. You have an ability. I can help you develop it, but you will have to deal with this situation. Once you figure it out, people will seek help from you. I also have no idea what she means by this, but I didn't ask any questions. Other psychics I've seen have said that I'm really powerful, and if I've ever thought about developing my abilities. This is the allure I think a lot of people would find cool, but I find it completely horrifying. I'll never pursue this. I just want to be normal. I just want to sleep. Towards the end of the reading, she said, "That's your wife out there. Did she want a viewing?" Just to note, my wife had shown up in the waiting room, yet somehow knew this even though the doors were closed. Yes, she wanted to talk with you. No, not tonight. Not after talking to you. Maybe on Tuesday. I've got to go do some meditation in preparation for Tuesday. The fortune teller did not meet with me or my wife after this reading. Her shop wasn't open for business for the rest of the week, and she would not return any of my phone calls until later that week while we were there. I called her and left voice messages with no return calls from her. I can't fathom the reason why she would do everything she has done for us thus far, take no money and then simply not communicate with me. She effectively cut me off. This worried me for a time, but I eventually stopped sweating on this. I didn't need her help as time progressed. I was a skeptic my entire life on the paranormal, even when I was at ground zero with my own incidents. I dismissed them as sleep disorders, having a medical basis at worst. Having 3 independent New Agers engage me at length and nail stuff they couldn't possibly have known about has turned me into a believer in the supernatural. While I believe in the supernatural and that New Age people have actual power, I personally and strongly advise against pursuing this. Out of desperation, I gave up and got involved. While they did convince me it's real and led me to ending my self-loathing and getting lasting peace, their superpowers didn't prove any magical cure. Maybe they were put in my path to learn the simple lesson of love thyself. That is what makes most sense to me. My belief is that these demonic entities latch onto your own initial damage that's deep inside of you, and unfortunately, only you can remove this hook they have onto you. I don't believe I did this alone. However, my entire life I've been a Christian. Though admittedly, I'm probably not a paragon of how you live your life. I've always felt safe while I'm awake and doing normal everyday things. My gut tells me this is God's presence. In my twilight dreams, however, I don't feel this same level of protection, and have a theory. Hell's worst punishment, biblically speaking, is the lack of God's presence. My theory for these twilight dreams is that I'm glimpsing into some version of hell. I'm on their territory, and there is a lessening of God's presence. I think I have a kernel of His presence still in me, but I have an indescribable fear that it's completely off the charts. I have just enough help and strength to scream my way out of there, thankfully. My advice is to not pursue supernatural things, because it won't end well. Engagement is almost certain to ensure something hooks onto you. Regarding my affinity for dogs, I now believe this to be instinctive in them. I think dogs can see things people can't. I think dogs sense the oppression around me and instinctively engage me protectively. I genuinely appreciate this and happily accept it. I always feel more protected with any dog around. They are pretty amazing creatures. Presently, I get tested periodically by these entities, though it's not the same one that haunted me my entire life. I can tell you how I know this, unfortunately, but they do check in to test the waters. I had one of the other nights after 3 months of peace. It was twilight. I heard rumbling electrical resonance and felt a tingle in my head. I felt the isolation, heard the shuffling outside my bedroom door, and saw the door open, heard the scrambling feet, and saw a levitating grey animal. It was like a dead thing floating up at the foot of my bed. It was trying to emulate a friendly animal, perhaps a dog, but it did a very poor physical manifestation and was reeking of evil, closer to roadkill, just floating in the room staring at me. I stared at it and was able to utter, "Get out now," very weakly, but with conviction. I awoke instantly in my twilight dream, and in the waking world I heard "now" in both places, if that makes sense. The room was evil, dark and overbearing one moment, and then completely clear and normal and pleasant in the next instant. I didn't wake up screaming. I woke up fully aware that I had just ordered it out. There was no confusion, fuzziness, or fading memory that you usually have with your dreams after you're awoken. My only real agenda is to get these sort of life experiences out to the masses. I hope to get acknowledgement that people like us aren't crazy, and ideally, help people directly or indirectly start to deal with this by having a conversation about it. I was in Louisiana 2 years ago. I was in an antique store and came across a case of dolls close to the floor. I looked inside and a doll literally blinked in front of me without me touching it or anything in the vicinity, fully upright, as the eyes open and close when laying down for some of these. I came back to Louisiana to visit family, and I went back 2 years later and purchased the doll. Maybe it was a mistake. This doll had very quickly began doing strange things. Full body apparitions, loud noises upstairs when no one was there, and making me itchy when I was around it. It also brings joy when it's not doing weird stuff, and it blinks its eyes in full view and isn't subtle at all. I sleep with the doll as I would rather it be closer to me where I can see it at night, rather than somewhere I can't. I believe it to be harmless. It's from the 60s and it's a little Dutch boy. Looks like he's wearing home-sewn clothes and hand-whittled clogs. Does anyone have advice on what I should do? I really don't know. But there's a bit more. I thought about getting rid of the doll. I couldn't sleep for 4 days after sharing the first experience that I had. I was always looking around behind my shoulder and was scared beyond belief. I didn't want to get rid of it on my grandma's property, so I had to keep it until I was somehow able to dispose of it. I saw a full body apparition several times. It looked like a human, but fully flesh. It was almost like a hairless cat, dirty, and seemed a bit bloody. Like I said, this was in the human shape, so it was extremely terrifying. Once I found an opportunity, I ridded myself of it. I drove into the country and found a tree with a hole in it, covered the doll in holy oil and left. My great-grandmother just so happened to have blessed oil by the Pope. Not exactly sure which one though. After that, everything went back to normal. That antique shop seemed to have many seemingly haunted objects. Before I left to return to Georgia, I made sure to swing by the shop to say goodbye. I looked on the floor and saw a very old flat doll with a worn-away print on the top, being held down by a large brass cross, and I got a shiver down my spine. A few years back, I was working an inpatient unit. Most patients would come in, get uncontrollable symptoms managed, and then go back home for the rest of their days. Occasionally, we would get patients who would stay until the very end. These patients either paid out of pocket for the stay, as most insurers won't cover inpatient hospice care, or they had really good insurance. Old school UAW workers. I have a ton of creepy stories working in this field, but there are a handful that really stand out to me. One of our long-term patients was an old auto factory worker named Joe. He was a salt-of-the-earth, blue-collar guy, and I liked him a lot. He wasn't shy with a dirty joke, and if he liked you, he gave you a nickname. Mine was Smitty. My last name being Smith, it was a natural choice. Not original, but I was proud to get the nod from Joe. Joe was dying of pancreas cancer, and because he never got married or had kids, he didn't want to die in his house, and in his words, mess up the resale value of his home. Not sure who was getting his money though. He had some nieces who visited him and tried to get him to come home with them so that he could be with his family when he died, but Joe wouldn't have it. I worked my arse off on that line for 35 years. Might as well reap the benefits now. Most people don't want to be in a clinical place like that, but Joe was at home there. I would do my rounds and pass my meds every time I went into Joe's room, and he'd have a new joke or try to get me to have a drink with him. Yes, some of the patients would get a drink if they wanted. They are dying, and doctors have no problems writing an order for a shot of whiskey or a beer. I'm not ashamed to admit that I got close to Joe. I spent my breaks playing cards or listening to his old drinking stories. Most of the time, he had a great gravelled laugh that always ended in a cough, and was generally a great guy. Now, unlike most of our patients, Joe was low maintenance. He had very little pain, which was super uncommon for pancreatic cancer, and required very little nursing. It's not uncommon for our patients to see things, but this normally happens when the patient is declining and other symptoms are present. Joe never had a decline and was always of sound mind. One day, I arrived at work and started my rounds. When I entered Joe's room, as all rooms are private, I was greeted with the usual off-color joke about my weight or being from the south. Joe just stared at me with a very confused look on his face. I asked if everything was okay, And Joe gave a quick, "Yeah," and went back to his newspaper. I shrugged it off and went about my day. The man was dealing with his mortality, and it can always be dick jokes and rainbows. Every time I went into Joe's room, it was that same confused look, and he was super dismissive to me. This kept up for half the shift, till I finally asked if everything was okay. Joe's response was something I'll never forget. "Yes, Smitty, everything's fine, but I'm not sure about that guy who's been following you around all day." I worked alone. No one was with me. I asked who he meant. "That tall guy, in black, who's been right with you all day." I was confused and creeped out. I was the only male employee on shift that day. I made the mistake of asking Joe if this tall man in black was with me now. "Oh yes, Smitty, and you don't look too happy." My nursing training kicked in, and you don't indulge in patient hallucination. But this wasn't normal. Joe was calm, definitely bothered, but cool. I told Joe not to worry about him, and couldn't get out of there fast enough. I'm not much of a believer, and really didn't know what to make of it. Sadly, I wussed out and avoided Joe as much as I could for the rest of the shift. I regret this to this day, because Joe died that night, shortly after my shift nurse who relieved me called me to let me know that Joe had passed. I headed back to the unit and ended up showing up when Joe's niece was coming out of his room. She was red-eyed, and honestly, this part of the job I'm not the greatest at. I gave the standard condolences and said, "He's in a better place." Joe's niece's face snapped towards mine, and she had fire in her eyes. "He was a drunk asshole that beat his pregnant girlfriend until she miscarried. If he's anywhere, it ain't better than here." I was speechless. I had dozens of conversations with Joe, but we never talked about his past. The niece stormed off. I stood there for a second, and finally went in to say goodbye to my friend. Joe was laying in bed. The staff have washed and prepared the body, and he was waiting for the funeral home. I'm not an overly sentimental guy, but I got attached to Joe, and it felt wrong to not say goodbye. When I got close to Joe, I noticed something strange. Most people, when they pass, do so with their eyes closed, but not Joe. Joe's eyes were wide open, and maybe it was the lingering effect of earlier that day and the run-in with the niece, but I swear those eyes were frozen in fright. Whatever the hell he saw before he went scared him. This happened when I was around 15 or 16. I still remember the craziest details, but this is not one of them. Since I was a kid, my biological mother had sort of shoved religion down my throat, so over the years of not seeing her and just living with my dad, I had developed my own belief in myself and my independence. Ghosts, spirits, and energy weren't really on my mind at the time. I was always interested in horror movies and stuff like that. My dad was on a trip to Mexico. He had called me one day after I got home from school and asked me if I wanted anything, as my dad and stepmom would usually buy me a little traveler gift or something when they went on business trips. I said yes and asked him what the options were, whether it be a keychain or a poster. He said he had stopped in a shop that was sort of deserted, like it was being shut down or going out of business, and it was located in the middle of nowhere. He said that there were some old paintings, and being into art at the time, that really piqued my interest. I only remember the description of the one painting that he had described, solely because of the occurrence that had happened once it was in my possession. It had a very old, dark wooden frame, and it wasn't super smooth, but wasn't rough or beat up or anything like that. The painting itself looked like it was on white marble, and what the painting is that almost a cartoonish traditional skeleton dancing in a graveyard wearing an outfit that Shakespeare might wear. The painting overall looked really cool, but as soon as I got it, something was off, and it wasn't super noticeable. But when you look at it, it just was unsettling in the slightest. The first occurrence I had with this painting was the first week after I had owned it. It was hanging over my door, and may I add that at the top of the painting there is an extremely super thick rope that is used so I can put a nail there so that it can hang. I had gotten out of the shower after I got home from school, and I walked into my room. As soon as I walked through the door, the painting fell, and I felt the wind from the painting fall behind me, and it felt like it was a few inches away. Any other day I would have just dismissed it and thought about how crappy it would have been if the painting had hit me, but I didn't realize that there was something extraordinary going on. So I put my clothes on, got a stool, and spent about 3 minutes making sure the painting was not going to come off the nail. When I got off the stool, I gently pushed the side of the painting to watch it swing back and forth to ensure that it would stay put. I had to make sure that the only way the rope would come off the nail was if you were to push directly up and pull it off. I left and walked into my bathroom to take a leak and pick up my clothes from the floor, and when I walk in, back through the door into my room, the painting fell off and hit me in the shoulder. This had honestly freaked me the hell out on many different levels, and it doesn't even stop there. I picked up the painting from the floor and then tossed it in the closet with all my dirty clothes. And being at about 15 or 16, obviously it was just a pile on the floor. After about a month, I'd told one of my friends about what happened with the painting, and to this day something tells me that I probably shouldn't have told anyone about this, because nothing had even happened until I brought it up with him. The next morning before I had to go to school, it was extremely early, and I had woken up and couldn't get back to sleep. And it was before any of my parents woke up. I couldn't get back to sleep because I didn't realize that my instinct was picking up that there was something else in the room with me. I sat up and just sat there and stared at the closet doors. I sat there for about 5 minutes, debating on whether or not I wanted to see what had sounded like scratching coming from the inside of my closet. I threw up my blankets, pulled my feet onto the floor, but as soon as I stood up, the moving in the closet stopped. At this point, it was reacting to the sound of me, which was scary and terrifying because I realized that the painting was in there, and from what had just happened the month before. I stood there for a solid minute just staring at the door, and when my anxiety got so high, I just ran up to the door and threw it open. Nothing. Just a pile of clothes, and no, the clothes weren't a month old. I just kept the painting on the floor because I really didn't want to touch it. I just stood there looking into the closet and down to the floor when I noticed the corner of the painting. As soon as I made eye contact with it, there was an inhumane and grotesque, deep-pitched growl that emanated from the closet. And the scariest thing about all this was that I could feel the sound vibrations in the floor and in my chest, and there wasn't even anything there. I was feeling the vibrations from something I couldn't even see that was making the noise. I ran out the room and went downstairs for the remainder of the hour that I had, until I had to actually get up for school, and sat on the couch watching TV in the kitchen with all the lights on downstairs. After this happened, my mental health rapidly declined, and I was diagnosed with clinical depression, anxiety disorder, and ADD, all of which I'm sure I would have been diagnosed with regardless. It just felt like when I was home, these feelings intensified by 10. My parents didn't believe me, so I gave the painting to my dad and told him to put it in storage and that I didn't ever want to see it again. About a year later, and a quarter, I was 17. I had switched rooms and moved into my sister's old room because she'd moved out. I'd put the painting up on the wall, but was only there a week until I had an experience where I woke up with my body facing the wall and couldn't move. I'd passed out and left my door open and heard something had started from the stairs and then began to walk through the hallway and into my bedroom. As soon as the steps stopped by the side of my bed, I could move, but nothing was there. My family owns a big dog and a small dog, but I know it wasn't the dog's, because when they walk on the wooden floor, you can hear the sound of nails, and it's very high-pitched. I haven't seen the painting since after that happened. I saged my entire house and hit a dip in my mental health again. It was messed up and evil. I was paranoid, and my parents thought I was just lying, since I was also dealing with the issues between me and them. Safe to say, I never want to see that painting again, for fear of what it might do. For context, I am a Christian. I was at the grocery store doing the usual shopping, and in comes this woman. She was wearing a giant backpack and jogging attire. From the get-go, you could hear her mumbling and talking to herself. I reckon she was probably schizophrenic. It got worse though. She was more aggressive and started shouting, telling the voices to stop and leave her alone, and that they've been dead for 15 years. People were noticing, so they moved away. The staff avoided her uncomfortably. So I get the idea. Maybe if I pray for her, I thought I'd ask God to free her from this thing. Something like, let her in Jesus' name get out of there. I was standing way off behind her as I whispered, so she couldn't possibly have heard me. But just as I said amen, the woman abruptly said out loud to herself, "She belongs to us. You won't get us out of here. She's ours. Go away. You don't have the right." This was really loud. I've prayed for people before, but I did not expect that, and honestly was very shocked. I was so surprised, I paid and left. I wasn't ready for a fight. I might try again if I get the opportunity, but that is certainly one of the more interesting paranormal experiences I've ever happened. So, to the woman who may or may not have a demon in her head, I'm going to pray for you and hope you're okay. Unfortunately, I'm a Goodwill addict, and I saw this gorgeous picture that I simply had to have. It was a whole $5, and when I took a closer look, it was a black and white puzzle that someone had put into a heavy-duty frame. A big cat sprawled out into the snow, with snow falling all around him, done in black and white in a steel frame. It was very beautiful. Anyway, I get it home and hanging it in my guest bedroom. My bestie comes to visit, and she is standing in the guest bedroom doorway getting ready to take a shower. I come over to the doorway, and we were there just gabbling, and something caught our eyes at the same time. The picture lifted up and away from the wall, and gently fell onto the carpet while propping itself up against the wall. She looks at me and asks if I had just seen that. I reply that I did. This picture/puzzle is very heavy. 2 zigzag brackets in the back to hang on 2 corresponding wall nails. I picked the picture up and made sure everything was secure. The brackets were perfectly fine. The nails were both still in the walls with no sign of stress. My bestie stays a few days longer and leaves. While she is with me, no other events occur, and after she leaves I get this floodlight on the closest door, and there are 0 lights from the window, and I'm standing in a pitch black bedroom with a glaring bright light on the closet door. It lasted 1 week and disappeared. It was simply too odd. Years ago, I worked as an orderly in a small hospital on the night shift. Most of the work was just answering call lights and cleaning up messes. We had one room whose call light would go off seemingly on its own. Patients in the room would deny pushing it, or it would go off when the room was empty. The story the older nurses told was of an elderly lady who spent a lot of time in that room before she passed, and it's her asking for help. We all laughed about it, and it was a long time running joke, and whenever anything peculiar happened in that room, it was just attributed to Vickie looking for attention. 35 years have passed since that time, and after a career, I find myself working in the same hospital as a retirement job. Vickie's room has since been converted into a surgical area, bright and shiny and new. But whenever I pass that area and all of the lights are off, I swear out of the corner of my eye I can see someone standing in the PACU. I now know it's an optical illusion, but it still gives me the shivers. I recently told this story to a friend who worked here all the time, and now whenever I see her, she swats me for telling her the story, because she has started to see Vickie out of the corner of her eye as well. This happened when I was in my sophomore year in high school. I was at my friend Nick's house with a couple of other friends, and we were all staying the night. It was just the 4 of us high schoolers there that night. That same night, there was a severe weather warning due to a storm that had the potential to create tornadoes, which it did closer to the Connecticut River Valley and parts of Massachusetts. The wind, even without a tornado, was intense, and we were just glad that this house had a good-sized yard with no tall trees to fall. It was pouring rain. There was lightning and everything. We're all up on the 2nd story of the top floor, and one of our friends was asleep and somehow managed to sleep through this. The rest of us were all awake, talking about how we weren't in danger of tornadoes, except one of us who was convinced we were all going to perish that night. Mid-conversation, there's a loud bang, and the entire house rattles. Okay, that's not supposed to happen. What could it be? We come up with some theories. Tree down, no trees. Earthquakes, no reports. Wind, well, there's no downed trees outside. And we're down to the bulkhead just slamming shut. Or something spooky. We grab a few knives and head downstairs. In the living room, we all notice for the first time how many porcelain dolls Nick's mother owns. We check every room to find nothing but those creepy dolls, but nothing that could cause a bang. There are 2 rooms left, the basement, and a closet that's barely enough to fit folded linens. We decide that if the bulkhead isn't locked, then we forgot to close it, and there'll be water in the basement, and the sound we heard was the wind knocking it shut. If the bulkhead is locked, we remembered to close it. The bulkhead was locked shut. The floor was bone dry, and the sound wasn't the bulkhead. There's one room left, the damn closet. What could be in a closet big enough for only Houdini himself to squeeze into? We open it up, and something falls, and we hear the sound of glass shattering. We look at the ground. It's one of the dolls. What was it doing in the closet? And why would it be propped up so easily to let it fall? We didn't care. We just went upstairs and did our best to fall asleep. It's something we all try not to think about, but everyone will once in a while be over there and hear a murmur or a grunt, and we'll never know where it's coming from. We also don't know whatever happened to the remains of that broken doll. When visiting my grandma's farm as a kid, I saw some paranormal activity. Her house was built in the 1700s. I believe it was a slave plantation and a Confederate hospital during the Civil War at one point. I was 14 or 15 and playing in the woods on her property, and as I was nearing the creek behind her house, I looked up, and off to my side about 50 feet away was a man in a grey uniform. He watched me play for a minute or two, and when I looked up again, he tipped his hat, turned around and faded into the woods. I figured it was a deer hunter, as the property is 275 acres of wooden farmland, and people hunted there a lot. I went to my grandma and told her what I saw, only because I saw her car in the driveway. She said nobody was hunting that afternoon, and that it must have been the soldier. She said that he has been spotted by a few people, especially when visiting the farm for the first time. She said he guards the house, which was a temporary hospital in his time, to make sure they aren't a threat. She commented that if he tipped his hat, is that he approved of my presence. I have no idea what it actually was, but I will never forget it. I was 17 at the time. Me and my stepbro were outside sneaking a smoke and just talking. It was wet out, and we were standing by a window with a mesh screen. I was telling him about conspiracies in Hollywood, mostly having to do with Satanism in the music industry, and the symbolism behind it. I told him about the pentagram, and he didn't know what it was. Instead of describing it to him, I began to draw one on the wet screen. As soon as I connected the circle, we both heard a deep, guttural growl directly behind us. We both looked back and saw nothing but an open field. We then competed to be the first one through the back door, shoving match style, and to this day, I don't mess with pentagrams, as I don't want to accidentally summon another demon. This happened a few years ago, when I was 15 and had just started buying cassette tapes. Now, the reason why I did this isn't relevant to the story, so I'll make it quick. As many of you may know, concert tickets have gone up since not many people buy CDs, records, or cassettes anymore. Me, trying to be a world changer, I figured I could start a ripple effect and everyone else would magically start to buy them again. Yeah, right. Anyway, I'm a huge Metallica fan, and I had been looking for a Master of Puppets tape. I'd basically given up on trying to get my hands on a Kill 'Em All tape. I didn't trust eBay or most online retailers, but lucky for me there was a guy at my school who sold CDs called Dave. He was a little on the sketchy side, but at least I knew that if I got ripped off, I'd have an easier time getting my money back. I approached him one day and asked if he had a Master of Puppets tape. As soon as I asked him this, he went white as a sheet, looked extremely sick, and I said, "Dude, are you alright?" He didn't say anything, and just looked at me as if I had said a forbidden name. A few seconds go by, and he grabs the tape from his locker, practically throwing it at me, taking my $10 as he speed walks away. I stood there for a moment, still in shock by how he reacted. I looked at the box. It looked like a normal Master of Puppets tape box. You know, with the graveyard cross headstones and the hands in the dark red sky. Then came the moment of truth. The actual tape, and if it was legit. I opened the box and inspected it. Yep, it was legit. Now my only concern was if the thing actually worked, because it wouldn't have surprised me if I went home and it wouldn't play. My concern was soon replaced with dread, and honestly, I didn't know why. Something about the tape began giving me bad vibes. My stomach felt sick just holding it. My instincts kept telling me to just throw it in the trash and get one somewhere else, but I didn't. Fast forward through school, I get home, pop the tape into my cassette and press play. Nothing. I take the tape out and put it back in. Still nothing. I take the damn tape out about 6 times, and nothing happened. At this point I was annoyed, because I thought this guy had ripped me off. That would explain the behavior when he gave it to me. I gave it one final attempt, and it didn't work, so I was going to confront him the next day. I put the tape in and pressed play once more, and there was nothing. Well, that guy better not have spent that $10. And as soon as I was reaching to turn it off, a blood-curdling scream came spilling out of the tape. Unless James Hetfield had taken hormone pills to sound like a woman, I didn't think the screaming was coming from him. I mean, the sound. It sounded like she was being buried alive. Whatever the hell it was, I hoped it wasn't real. I repeatedly pressed pause, but it wouldn't stop. This went on for about 5 minutes, and in that time, a light bulb 5 feet away from me exploded. Other people may just shrug this off as a coincidence. I couldn't do that, no matter how hard I tried. After 5 minutes it stopped. However, the tape didn't. It went straight into the song Battery. Keep in mind that I've listened to the whole album numerous times, and while Battery is the first song played, there is absolutely no screaming whatsoever. I didn't know whether to be scared of the screaming, or the fact that it made the light bulb explode. I grew a pair and played it again. This time there was no screaming, and it played like a normal album. How is that possible, I thought? How can it have that horrific scream 1 minute and play as if nothing happened the next? Was there something wrong with the cassette player? I didn't know. But how could a cassette player cause something like that? Giving into my stupidity, I played the tape again. This time all the lights in my house went out, surrounding me in darkness, alone with this tape. By now I had lost myself. I knew that the tape was giving me bad vibes, and by the way Dave had acted, he had to have known something was up with it. I had enough. I took that thing out and completely smashed it. After smashing it, I made sure to put it at the very bottom of the trash barrel outside, because there was no way I was keeping this thing inside, even if it was in the trash can under the kitchen sink. I couldn't sleep that night. The nightmares I had about the screaming woman kept waking me up all night. Not only that, I felt like something was watching me throughout the night. My skin crawls just thinking about it. The next day when I went to look for Dave, he wasn't there. Going through the motions at school, I felt nothing but dread. Had something happened to him? Was it because of that tape? Or was he just skipping? There was no way to tell. I got home and I felt the urge to look into the trash barrel. I slowly opened the lid, praying to see its smashed remains at the bottom. Nothing. It was gone. My heart dropped. The feeling of dread was now getting overwhelming, and I felt an anxiety attack coming on. I tried to reassure myself that maybe I had just thought I put it in there. Maybe it was inside the trash can inside. But no. I specifically remember bringing it out there. All of a sudden, I heard screaming. The woman, and it sounded like it was coming from inside. I ran inside and my legs turned to jelly. The tape I had smashed was now playing in the cassette player, not to mention that it had somehow gotten inside. There was nothing I could do but sit there, waiting for this to end, hoping to God it was just a nightmare that I would wake from at any moment. I have no idea what the hell happened to that tape to make it so evil, but I don't want to find out. The sounds of the woman's screams still haunt me. It also doesn't help, the tape keeps coming back, no matter how many times I destroy it. However, I learned a lesson from this, and I hope you did too. Be careful who you buy from. I work in a hospital, and my shift is anywhere from 7 in the morning to 8 at night, and sometimes later if I get called in. First, some background on the hospital. It's right next door to a pretty prominent college campus, which draws in a lot of people, students and otherwise. And there are some houses just behind the hospital past the main employee parking lot. Although the hospital isn't in a bad area, there have strangely been a few grisly crimes in that area. Once, a man murdered his wife behind the hospital, and then tried to end his own life. Why he did it there, no one knows. Neither of them worked at the hospital or anything. And on another occasion in those houses behind the hospital, a man was found stabbed to death in his basement, and the killer was never found. Alas, the main employee parking lot is very close to where both these crimes took place. About 10 years ago, a new hospital had been in front of the old one, but the old one wasn't torn down for many years after, so it just sat there empty. There used to be a tiny little parking lot directly in front of the aforementioned old hospital that, despite its close proximity to the creepy building, was in high demand because it was just a short walk to the employee entrance. I had 2 creepy encounters, one in that small little parking lot and one in the big main parking lot. On this particular night, I had gotten done at 7:30, but it was winter, so dark outside. I had parked in the large main parking lot, but I was in a pretty far away spot, close to the houses that run behind the hospital. Now, I had an actual legit stalker from the time I was 19 until 25, if not longer. So I was always on edge about walking home at night in these sort of situations. That being said, it was just past 7:30, so it was early, which is probably why I let my guard down just a little bit. As I was walking to my car, I saw this guy walk in front of the houses, and I just assumed that it was a college student or just someone out for a walk. A lot of college kids rent those houses because of their closeness to the campus, so it wasn't uncommon to see people out at night. But on this night, this person was the only one out, and what kind of set off some alarm bells was that he was wearing all black from head to toe, including a stocking cap. It was cold that night, but not that cold, so that seemed a little weird to me, but still, I told myself it was nothing. As I approached my car, this guy stopped walking when he noticed me, turned to face me, watched me for a few seconds, and then took off in my direction. He'd been walking at a leisurely pace, but when he saw me, he changed direction to come my way. He wasn't quite running, but he was walking super fast. I sprinted to my car, unlocked my door, threw myself and my stuff inside and locked the doors, and turned the engine on. All of this happened really fast, from the time he saw me to the time I entered my vehicle. It had to have only been about 10 to 20 seconds at most. I didn't waste any time putting the car into drive, but before I could go, I heard the guy bang on my car window and saw him out of the corner of my eye. I didn't look at his face because I was so terrified, though I wish now that I had. All I did was speed out of the parking lot. When I looked behind me, he was just standing there where my car had been. I didn't end up telling security though, and I realize now this was a massive oversight on my part. And normally, I probably would have. I was just so shaken that it didn't even occur to me until later. Luckily, no one was attacked in that area that night. The other encounter happened in the small parking lot. I had gotten called into work, so it was later than I was usually there, around 11. Now I always get weird vibes from the old hospital, but I figured it was just because, it was this creepy abandoned hospital with dark windows. Anyone could be in there, squatting or hiding or planning something nefarious, and I learnt that for a fact on this night. I had parked in the small parking lot and had just started walking to the hospital when I heard something behind me. It was someone talking. Although I didn't hear what the person said, it was enough to stop me, and I listened. The person spoke again, and this time he said, "Hey," like he was calling out to get my attention, not just greeting me. That was it. But it was a bit clearer this time, and I could tell it was coming from behind me, aka in the direction of the creepy hospital. I turned around and didn't see anyone, and for some reason I looked towards this door near where I parked, which had a large window in the top half. All of a sudden, someone popped up into view through that window. Some guy that had been crouched inside the old hospital behind the door, so that I couldn't see him. This obviously scared the crap out of me, but I was so shocked that I just stood there. The guy called out, "Hey you, come over here," while motioning for me to come over there. Because I'm a rationally thinking person, I didn't go over there to find out what this guy wanted, but instead ran to the main hospital, and this time I did tell security. They called the police but never found anyone in there, though to be honest, I'm not sure how well they looked. After that, I never parked there again, and it was closed shortly thereafter because they finally decided to tear down the old hospital. I doubt the two events are connected, but who knows? My daughter has several old porcelain dolls. When she was 9, she got a sudden interest in them. I had never bought them for her because they are often very delicate, and I didn't want her to break them. I took her to the Goodwill and she begged me for one. I let her buy it, since she takes very good care of her things, and I quickly noticed something was different in my house. I felt like I was being watched. Shortly after that, she asked for another doll at the Goodwill. Over the years, she has collected 3. I noticed she was very careful about which ones she picked. She treated the dolls like gold, and she keeps them sitting up in the corner of her bed. She tells me the dolls like me, since I'm so careful with them when I move them to make her bed. I see shadows around my house and hear soft voices. Nothing that makes me feel in danger, and I'm getting used to it. But it is, nonetheless, very freaky. My good friend is a nurse's attendant. The strangest thing she's ever told me about was a woman who came into the ER after an attempt on her own life. The woman had cut her wrists and her throat. She had almost completely severed one hand, and her head was being held on by the skin at the back of her neck and some muscle. Somehow the paramedics got her to the hospital alive. My friend has also had to hold this woman's head in place while the doctors did their thing. The patient, to no one's surprise, passed, and the doctor made my friend look down the neck with the head held back as a little anatomy lesson. A story a nurse told the same friend. She was in the psych ward, and there was an adult male patient in a room with a glass door so that he could be seen. He liked to be naked and would often masturbate in the corner. One particular day, he decided to take a dump in the room and spread it all over the glass door. As the nurses are fighting to figure out what to do, he places both hands on the door, looks her straight in the eye, and licks up his own feces. While we're at it, a big shout out to the men and women who work in healthcare, and especially a big thanks to you nurses. You guys are heroes.